So, welcome back from lunch. I'd like to introduce the moderator of our third panel. Our third panel is on security lessons from the Snowden files. And so this panel is going to explore how reporters have reported on the NSA documents, how reporters have covered the NSA without documents, and what reporters can learn from what's happened over the last year and a half, whether it's from security or publishing or reporting. And so I'd like to turn it over to Lynn Oberlander, who is the general counsel for First Look Media. She's also the former general counsel of the New Yorker magazine, where I actually worked for her in law school. And I will let Lynn take it away from here.
Thanks, Trevor. It's really a great panel, and I had a lot of fun talking to them yesterday when we were trying to prepare for today. So we are going to leave a lot of time. In previous panels there were a lot of questions, and some didn't get answered. So we're going to try to leave a lot of time in this panel for questions from the audience. Be prepared. But let me introduce everyone first. I'm going to start at the far end with Julie Tate, who is a researcher par excellence at the Washington Post. She specializes in national security, intelligence, and defense issues. She was on the Post team that won the Pulitzer this past year for the public service related to the Snowden documents. And she has contributed to many other Pulitzer Prize-winning stories and has been awarded the Post Eugene Meyer Award in 2013, right? Yeah, thank you. Next to Julie is Spencer Ackerman, who is the national security editor for The Guardian. He was previously a senior writer at Wired, and he is the recipient of a 2012 National Magazine Award for digital reporting for his reporting on the FBI's training materials on Islam and Muslims, which I recently had the opportunity to read. It's a great little frightening story, so I recommend it. Siobhan Gorman is next to Spencer, and she is the intelligence correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Previously, she was the Washington correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, covering intelligence and security. And before that, she was the staff correspondent for National Journal, covering Homeland Security, Justice, and Intelligence. And in 2006, she won the Delta Chi Award for Washington correspondence for her coverage of the NSA. And then next to me is Micah Lee, who is a technologist at the Intercept, which is the publication of First Look Media. He is a founder and board member of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and he is the author of Encryption Works. Previously, he worked as a staff technologist for EFF. Now, the other thing I will say about Micah is that he is a man of incredible patience, because before I started at First Look, when I was, because we were practicing good hygiene, as we've been discussing here, everything we do and all of our emails are encrypted, and even though I have been in this space for a long time, I had no idea how to use PGP or GPG or any of it, and Micah had to spend a good 2.5 hours one night remotely from California hooking up working with me to hook up my PGP encryption. So if you have any questions, you should ask him. He's great. He's great. So everyone here, let's start with the question, and everyone can, I have some specific questions, but everyone can jump in as we did. Let's start with the question that Trevor asked. How has national security reporting changed in the last year or since the Snowden disclosures? Yeah, go ahead.
As a researcher, I'm not primarily communicating with sources, so I haven't had to direct sources to send things to me encrypted. But I've had to sort of, in doing research on the Snowden documents and different stories, had to make a choice of whether or not I wanted to research over Tails or Tor or in the open. Everything that I'm looking at as a researcher should really be open source. So it's sort of doesn't make sense to be on Tails, right? But at the same time, you don't want people to understand, to know the subject of your investigation, et cetera. So we'd make a choice on things like that. But the databases I use primarily don't work on Tor or Tails. Nexus and Accurate don't generally work when you're doing that kind of research. So it's so that's sort of changed. That's the way it's changed things for me.
I'm just going to follow up on that. Have you I mean, are you using any, and if you can feel that you can share it, like if you're doing a Nexus search on an individual and that maybe you aren't that excited about having folks know which individual it would be, would you also run a Nexus search on 6 other individuals at the same time, or not really?
I think that we have done things like that, but you know, like they can see what I'm doing all the time. I don't think it really makes a difference. Nexus can, you know, so not really.
Spencer?
Yeah, so 2 things. First, an internal sort of best practice we started learning at the Guardian. When you are communicating about an archive set this big that requires a lot of follow-on reporting, and you're doing this in an organization that exists, across, an ocean, we had to think much more seriously about communicating securely with ourselves before we could really properly get these stories out. And from what I hear from some of my colleagues at other news organizations, this has really become a very tangible change that other organizations as well as us have just started prioritizing, getting smarter about. A continuity that I think is sort of unfortunate that I still see. I know this was sort of touched on the first panel, but getting sources to use encryption or getting them to trust themselves enough to use something that a lot of people still consider technically complex and beyond their scope has been a challenge, even for people who you would really think ought to appreciate more acutely perhaps than reporters. That's something that I think, if we can, if 2013 to 14 was a period in which journalists became much more aware of their digital vulnerabilities, and now we're starting to see over the last couple weeks, I know this is a point that Chris Egoyan likes to make, that lawyers need to be way more aware of it. I'm hoping that going into 2015, that'll be something that sources become much more willing to adopt.
Yeah, it's actually for that reason that I would say that, the actual process of national security reporting, I don't actually know. I think it's changed marginally. I think that there is, to some degree, a heightened awareness of communicating in various sort of protected forms. But I tend to go with what the source is comfortable with, as long as it doesn't seem like it's some sort of egregious, risk in terms of securing your communications. The nature of the people that I'm talking with, usually I'm talking with people who know more about this kind of thing than I do, so I'm pretty comfortable taking their lead, not always, but I actually think that the impact on the process of reporting is not as large as one might expect. At least that hasn't been my personal experience. In terms of sort of sources' willingness, I think that there are a few people who are a little bit more willing to do it, particularly because there are products now that make it a little bit easier. But the challenge is that encryption is still sort of a clunky thing, and it requires a 2.5-hour tutorial. And so to get a source to do that seems like a lot to ask. So I guess that would be my main observation. Not as much change.
So when the Snowden stuff all started, I wasn't actually working in journalism. So it's hard for me to tell exactly how everything has changed. But since I've been, working with First Look and with the Intercept, it's definitely been exciting to get to build everything from the ground up in a way that seems to be entirely different than the industry standard. Like everyone using PGP and SecureDrop didn't used to exist, and now it exists and has been getting better and better and better. And it's like a way now that sources don't really need to know anything. They just need to download Tor browser, and then they can communicate anonymously with journalists. And so I think that this is one of the big things that has changed, is that there's more tools. They're getting easier to use, and I think that in the future it won't be nearly as much of an ask to get sources to communicate with you securely, because hopefully what we use for sending messages will just be a lot more secure than it currently is. And I think that we're moving in that direction, and that's an exciting thing.
Can I make just one more point that it seems we shouldn't overlook? Maybe it's something that might seem a little obvious. But institutionally, there's a lot more hostility from the three-letter agencies that I definitely perceive, and think that there might have been understandable assumption on their part for a while that national security journalism had gotten somewhat docile. And I think that's gone, and I think they definitely think that's gone.
I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily, and I think the Guardian may have a different experience. I mean, the Journal didn't have the Snowden documents, and the government may end up viewing different organizations differently. I don't know that for a fact, because I haven't really discussed it with them. I actually feel like, having covered this now for a while, basically a decade, I actually feel like the Snowden documents have they put the government on the defensive. They've been forced to push out a bunch of stuff under FOIA that they never would have done otherwise, as far as I can tell. And I actually feel like, on balance, there are fewer requests not to publish. And frankly, when you push back, there's less resistance too. I actually feel like, sort of post-Snowden, the media's gained a little bit more of an upper hand in terms of those kinds of negotiations and that kind of leverage.
Spencer, any sense of that?
No, I mean, I take all Siobhan's points. I think that's, I have no reason to disagree, particularly with that institutional position. But I think, one of the reasons that they are pushing out more documents is to control their message in spite of us and in spite of what we seek to do. And I still feel, a lot of fairly, intense anger still. I think we feel. I imagine that First Look might have some experience with being on the receiving end of that in the Post as well.
Well, no, I think that's right. And meetings that I've had, not with Bob Litt, not with the NSA, but with other government groups, there really is a hostility. Which is not to say that Bob Litt doesn't share this, but there really is a hostility towards not so much the major media, because I think they recognize the importance of the Post and the Times and the Guardian and the real known fourth estate. But there's still a lot of skepticism, perhaps, or fear of the digital media, of the First Looks, of the Intercept, where I don't think they have a sense that they trust us to play by the rules and the rules that they're comfortable with. So we've certainly felt that, and of course, the First Amendment protects the whole range of media. So I think it's been a really trying. I think they're still trying to figure it out.
And I imagine that it's different for Guardian too, because it actually seems like it's a lot safer to do journalism in the United States right now than in the United Kingdom.
I'll share this story in a vague way. I had a meeting once with GCHQ in which they seemed way more solicitous of questions that I had than the NSA has. But now I imagine all my communications are even more compromised.
Well, I don't think this is not secret. So, one of the interesting things about dealing with the NSA is that for all of our discussion about encryption, they're not encrypted. So you cannot send them something to look at in a secure fashion. They want you to send it to them. You want them to comment on a document. You send them the document as an attachment to an email, because they, either for policy reasons or other reasons, they can't accept encrypted email. So that's been always really surprising to me. Continues. So, are there? I know we discussed this in some of the earlier panels, but are there, I have a first question. And this comes out of Snowden, of course, but it really comes out of some of the Plame and the earlier source questions that have arisen. As national security reporters, does every conversation you have with a potential source or a source start with a discussion of the level of protection you can give their identity, or is or not? I mean, has that changed over the last 8 or 9 years?
You guys don't mind if I
Go right ahead.
With established sources, no. And sometimes you sort of make a gesture in that regard if they're not already. To go back to what Siobhan said, you get in a rhythm of what a source is comfortable doing. With news sources, I emphasize this right from the jump.
Sean?
I mean, I would say that it's changed in that obviously I think there's just a potential source has a higher level of awareness, and this is something that I think would have been increasing over time, and Snowden would have just been a piece of that. You know, I mean, we had AP reporters' phone records being pulled and things like, I mean, there's a number of things that have kind of heightened that awareness, perhaps even in some cases more so than Snowden. So, I mean, I think that it's useful to have a conversation like that with a source. It may not be the first conversation that you have with them because, you know, you want to get a sense of where they're coming from and what kind of information they have before you sort of bother to get into that level of a detailed discussion. But certainly if you know, if it's a concern that a source has, then it's very important to have that conversation so that everybody's sort of on the same page.
Has the conversation maybe, I don't know, and I'm curious, do you think it shifted too much towards technological solutions? I mean, we heard this morning that there was some, you know, benefit to meeting face to face, but I mean, what about like, do people even consider saying, hey, if I got something in the mail, over the transom, you know, that'd be terrific. You know, like the old kind of things show up without having to worry about downloading Tor.
I don't think we've gone as far as we should with technological solutions. This tends to be a somewhat cloistered conversation. It tends to be something that we talk about more internally and getting or seeing people adopt, you know, greater OPSEC measures. You know, experience varies, but I don't really see us as being in a point where a conversation about, you know, PGP or OTR doesn't need to happen anymore. But, you know, usually it's always, you know, the concept of layered defense is always a good concept. You know, encrypt what you can, and in the substance of that encryption, you can discuss ways of meeting face to face. Thinking about a pre-Snowden story I did that revolved around certain documents that you referenced, Lynn. There was multiple layers of defense there that also did involve, you know, heavy emphasis on speaking in cars. You know, everyone here, I'm sure, has, you know, a similar experience of, you know, meeting face to face when at all possible, leaving devices behind and so forth. It's valuable when it matters, but, you know, across, you know, that's only one end of the spectrum, and I would still like to see a greater adoption of encryption tools, just generally with people that we talk with.
I also think that sometimes the like low tech, not using your computer ways might seem like they're safer because you're not leaving metadata trails and stuff, but a lot of times they're more dangerous. Because, you know, if you're using the postal system, then you have to drop a package in a post office box. And you have to worry about fingerprints, and, you know, like all of the metadata from the postal system gets scanned as well. And so there's all of these other issues to think about that are way more like physical forensics issues that you don't have when you're, you know, using Tor. And like, you know, some sources might never want to meet face to face. They might never want to let you know who they are. And that sort of thing, like using technology makes it safer in a lot of ways and in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah.
I think that there's such a wide array of circumstances, and so I think that encryption is useful in some of those circumstances. Meeting face to face is useful in some of those circumstances, and, you know, telephone conversations are useful in some circumstances. I also think that, I mean, if there's if you're not under investigation or your source is not under investigation, the likelihood that someone's picking up their conversation is pretty low. If they are under investigation, the likelihood that you're ultimately going to avoid having your communication somehow picked up or be followed is very low, I guess. So at some level, it's almost like, you know, if you're truly the focal point, I don't know. I'm not sure what protections are really going to afford you. I mean, yes, you can encrypt, but, you know, at some point, you know, it might prolong an investigation, but I don't know that it necessarily finally allows you to completely avoid detection.
I think also getting people, all sorts of different types of people in the newsroom to be familiar with encryption ended up being important at the paper in the sense that editors refused at some points to understand how to use PGP. So I would have reporters sending me encrypted documents to print out and then take to an editor's office so that they could read them. And honestly, if you think I'm going to print out a document and not read it before I hand it to somebody, you're just living in another world, you know? So you take the control as an editor or as an administrator, whatever, you know? You can take control of your information if you don't have Julie Tate decrypting it and printing it and, you know, having a conversation at lunch about it, maybe, you know? So, you know.
Has that changed now, though? Are the editors much more amenable to PGP?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for the most part, yeah. You know, I mean, there's some editors who aren't going to have time for it, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not like an untrustworthy person, but my point is that you don't control the information if you don't like get it yourself, you know. And so, I think that they've had an easier time with Jabber OTR, like that kind of communication. Like that's such a lighter footprint that the reporter and editor relationship can sort of work in that sort of fast-paced thing rather than here's my long discourse in this email, blah, blah, you know. Do you understand what I mean? Yeah.
It is, I mean, you know, when I was at the New Yorker, and certainly other places, and we had, you know, we had encrypted software. It wasn't PGP, but it was internally encrypted, or if you were sending it, I guess it was probably Office, but if you were sending it internally, it was encrypted and secure. And of course, we also had a protocol where everything got deleted after 3 months, which was not, I don't think, about source protection. I mean, it wasn't about source protection. It was about litigation defense, and it was really problematic because none of the journalists wanted their email to go away after 60 days or 3 months, and so a significant number of them just sent everything to Gmail, where it never gets deleted. But where it never gets deleted, and where you are in fact, you know, open to any kind of subpoena for the contents. And it was one of these situations that I'm actually concerned about when we talk about laying on all these levels of mandatory sort of encryption technology to communications, that people will just find a workaround if it is not if they don't see the value in it. Micah and I were actually talking a little bit about that, and I'm actually curious to see what he has to say when I frame it that way.
Yeah, I mean, any sort of security that you're trying to make people do needs to be usable, or people aren't going to do it. And so, I mean, I think that's a common problem. It's like, are you going to have to use memorize all of these passphrases and use security tokens and connect to VPNs and all this stuff just so you can check your email? Is this like a reasonable thing to require people to do, even if it makes your email way less likely to get hacked? So it's like always a balancing act. And I think that one of the things that people have started to learn after the Snowden revelations is specifically about the story of Glenn Greenwald, trying and failing at using PGP, and then trying and failing again, and then finally getting it, and almost losing Snowden as a source, is that usability is a security feature. Like, if your security software isn't usable, then people aren't going to use it, and like really what we need is people who are not hackers and experts at technology to be able to use this stuff. And so I think that that's like why there's such a huge push on making all of this encryption stuff that has existed for like decades, that like has been free for anyone to use, but no one's been using it because it barely works. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Micah, by the way, just wrote a piece for The Intercept where he described his own involvement in helping Glenn become able to receive the encrypted communications from Snowden, and he really needed you. I mean, that was not everybody is able to, and I needed you, of course, although with much less important issues. It's really tricky to self-install and figure it out, and
Yeah.
if you're not computer science person.
And I mean, I think it's getting easier, but like at the moment, you know what Julie was saying at like an earlier panel, if you like, it's important for everyone to be using PGP now because, you know, I get encrypted emails from people all the time that they probably wouldn't want to email me if they couldn't encrypt it, and it's because I have my PGP key like up on our website. And it's really obnoxious to use at the moment, and hopefully it'll get like less obnoxious to use, or we can just like get rid of email altogether and use some other system for messaging that's like secure by default, which would be awesome. But at the moment, it's kind of necessary.
Right, and I think that part of it is like just, it sounds so terrible, but you just have to practice. It's like muscle memory. You have to like practice it enough so when you're on deadline, you don't screw it up. You don't like forget to encrypt it or, you know, save it to a local drive. You know, it's just.
And so you don't have the situation where you like really need to be using encryption right now and you have no idea,
Right.
you don't know how to do it.
Right.
And so like it's better to know how to do it before you need it instead of after you need it.
Absolutely.
I feel like we're nearing a follow-up on Julia's sex joke.
Do you know what it is?
Well, I just mean like, why not? You know, let's view it like safe sex. Let's try and insist on people protecting themselves. It may be momentarily less enjoyable, but nevertheless, it's a good practice.
That's great. So I have one more question, and then I do want to, I think we can throw it open to questions. But so earlier, and I think there is this sense from some people, and we at first, like I think have a different strategy, but if you're using encryption, are you flagging, are you flagging yourself? Is your source flagging them? Is there a, is that like the big red flag? Yeah, Siobhan.
I mean, I have a source who actually just completely refuses to use encryption for exactly that reason. And, you know, he said, look no further than those Snowden documents that we have where it says, you know, among the minimization sort of exemptions, you have encryption. So, you know, why not sort of do security by obscurity, you know, hiding in plain sight? So, again, I mean, I think it also pays to listen to sources who, you know, have a different way that they want to communicate because they feel like that's safer.
I mean, I think that not using security tools because you're afraid that it will make you stand out or you're afraid that it will put you on a government list or something like that is a really dangerous mindset to get in. And it's like, it's true, there might be some risks, especially when you're, you know, like not in a first world country and you're going through border checkpoints and you have TrueCrypt on your computer or something. Like, I feel like those risks are a lot more serious. But I think that, you know, if more people start using encryption every day for all of their communications, then it will no longer be a like anomaly. It'll just be normal. And I think that the way that this will actually happen for real is when the communication platforms that people start using just do this by default, so that you know, if you, like, I mean, right now, if you have an iPhone and you send an iMessage to someone else with an iPhone, that's end-to-end encrypted. You don't even realize it. You know, there's problems. There are some problems with iMessage, but I think that if all of the ways that we start communicating, this is just built in, then there won't be this whole like, you know, there's all of these encrypted needles in this haystack, and so we want to like target them problem anymore. And I think it's just really important for, you know, I mean, especially journalists and lawyers and people who might be targeted by you know, government actors, to just be doing this as much as they can and not only doing it when they have a secret.
See if I can thread, you know, both those very good points. You know, Siobhan, I take your point. It's really, you know, a reality that you have to deal with. There are some people who just, you know, will freak out about encryption and worry about, you know, raising their level of vulnerabilities, even if, as Micah points out, that's a kind of dangerous road to walk down. You know, maybe one practical way out of it, if you're a journalist and you use a bunch of different security tools, publish that. have that somewhere. Whether it's an author's page, whether it's a Twitter account or something like that. I like to have ways that people can contact me securely, ways that people contact me in the open, and people can sort of, if they want to be sources, toggle through those using both open and more secure channels for the very hiding in plain sight reason that Siobhan mentions. Defense in depth really is a good idea. Layered defense is a really good idea.
One of the things that Siobhan mentioned that reminded me, this is just an aside, and I'm wondering if the audience or you feel that there are other pockets. I mean, I have found that among the people who are the most resistant, either personally or frankly structurally, to using any kind of encryption tool are lawyers. Outside lawyers, in-house are different, but calling a law firm, it is virtually impossible to send them an encrypted email, and their firms won't let them have the setup. And same thing with phone calls. A lot of their responses, folks I've dealt with are like, hey, it's a privileged conversation, and that's as far as I'm going to go. I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to talk to you now on my cell phone. I don't know if you've seen that, or if you've seen other groups that see resistance in some ways, or.
I would think that lawyers do feel like they do have the privilege, so they don't maybe need to take certain types of precautions. And again, it depends on the nature of the communication. Micah is right that if everybody were encrypting everything, then it wouldn't stand out. At the same time, until it's less cumbersome, not everybody's going to encrypt everything because it's way too much of a pain and not worth it. And so, I think that for lawyers especially, there's going to be that balance that they're trying to strike between, when it's worth it, when do you actually, cross that threshold where it makes sense. But, I don't know that I've really tested it specifically with lawyers, but I certainly haven't found, a huge interest in that kind of communication among lawyers.
Morgan, I see you want to add something.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned lawyers and well, we're privileged, and so this conversation should not be surveilled. And there was that. Oh, thanks. There was that recent event where there was talked about before impersonating the AP and that sort of thing. And I've noticed journalists actually also, there's that sort of sense of outrage that the surveillance establishment or the state would impersonate the press. Do you feel that that's actually sort of the sense that journalists are a privileged class that shouldn't or can't be targeted? Do you feel that that's actually disappeared more, or that that's still existent?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I see our naivety going away a lot more, and hopefully this will be the same thing with lawyers now that, look at what we've learned. Look at what GCHQ has just had to disclose in the UK. Look at what we've learned about we still have to learn about the nebulous interaction of vulnerability in the United States to NSA from lawyers. Look at all of the difficulties that the Guantanamo Bay bar had to go through. They've actively been surveilled. They've had their we know for a fact those communications have been collected, and oftentimes, at the risk of insulting my profession, never discount never discount just like straight up stupidity is the wrong word, but like if we didn't think of ourselves, maybe we just weren't thinking as hard as we should have, rather than thinking of ourselves as an actual privileged class, which itself is a form of privilege. But so I've talked myself out of that point. But yeah, hopefully, I do see that disappearing a lot more as we see as we learn more about what our vulnerabilities actually are.
Well, I think it's also interesting that it's part of why it's still a question is because it's been tested so little, and I don't, there are probably a lot of reasons for that, but it's vague because it's kind of purposely been left so by the government at this point, and I'm sure that Lynn has some pretty interesting thoughts on that. But I think in fairness to journalists, it's pretty hard to interpret what the level of expectation really should be. It's safest to assume no privilege. And that may ultimately be the case, but the answer is we actually just don't really know.
Well, in response, we really do. Journalists are, in fact, privileged, not absolutely privileged, and not absolutely privileged in respect to criminal, grand jury, and or national security type cases. But for
So like all the stuff that people here work on.
yes, yeah, exactly, exactly. But
It's the assumption that I was just talking about.
right. But for almost everything else, there is some level of privilege in almost every state, if not every state, and I guess Bruce could comment on that. I think it's like 49 states, but and in most of the federal districts and circuits, that there's at least a qualified privilege for both for confidential material sources and for notes. And so nobody should be able to get that material without having to make some sort of showing to a court that it's necessary for your story, that you can't get it somewhere else. So there is a privilege. So journalists are still treated differently, but not at the moment, certainly not on the Fourth Circuit, and not with respect to, criminal, national security type cases. And we don't have, as I'm sure everyone here knows, we don't have a federal shield law. So the great irony, this is a section I do know about this. I'll just say this is if you're in New York and you write a story, and it can be with a confidential source, and it is and you are subpoenaed in, at Center Street in the state courthouse, you, the reporter, do not have to, you don't have to show up. You can't be held in contempt. You don't have to provide the name of your source, period. It's an absolute privilege by statute. But if the subpoena comes out of the courthouse that is literally 30 feet away across the street in the federal courthouse, you don't have the same protection, and you might very well have to reveal your sources for the same story. And as a journalist, of course, you don't know whether you're going to get subpoenaed by, the New York State courthouse or the federal courthouse next door, the Southern District Courthouse. And so there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of dealing with your sources from the get-go. So I don't know. So we could use a federal shield law in my mind. And then on top of that, you get into the question of who's a journalist. I mean, everyone here is a journalist, very, very clearly under all of the definitions, but is a citizen journalist a journalist who would get protection of the shield law? Still very, very unclear. But let's throw this open for questions for the panel. Just sir in the back there.
Just as a lawyer who's present, there was a spate of ethics opinions, I would say maybe 15, 20 years ago, suggesting that it was unethical not to encrypt your communications with clients. But that died out pretty quickly because I think people came to the recognition that there are so many communications and so little genuine likelihood of actual attempts to obtain those communications that the burdens imposed by encryption just weren't worth undertaking. And so that spate of opinions, they're still out there, but I don't think anybody really takes them seriously anymore. And I think that's the reason. I think it's sensible as a lawyer not working in the national security area.
I personally agree with you, but I will say I've gone to a bunch of ethics CLEs recently where everyone raises the specter of whether people are acting unethically by not doing it. So that's it. Yes, over here.
So my name is Tina Iotis. I proposed and co-chair the Georgetown Cybersecurity Law Institute as a venue to teach lawyers about cyber law and to work with CIOs and CISOs and the government to protect their companies and organizations. And I would say that, and I teach ethics programs as well, exactly in this area, and I think under Rule 1.6, to maintain the client's confidences, there is not a lawyer today that would think it would be okay to not encrypt. So I'm quite astounded. I'd really love to know exactly which law firms you're working with that are not encrypting information as a general way of protecting client confidences, since the law firms, at least the major ones, are major targets of nation states to get valuable information. So it's shocking to hear what you said.
Huh. I didn't think it was surprising at all. I'm regularly getting emails from all sorts of attorneys with memos and things that are just, it says attorney-client privilege on top, but there's no encryption.
I also think that there's a difference between encrypting emails and encrypting like the databases or client information. I mean, you can encrypt different types of things. So I would not be surprised if law firms had certain client databases or whatever that they were encrypting, but their day-to-day email maybe wasn't.
Actually, it's the opposite. The day-to-day email is encrypted, and they're not doing a very good job of encryption at rest. They're doing a better job of encryption in transit.
Oh, that's
Encryption at rest is way easier.
That's surprising.
over here, this fellow over there at the.
Hi, my question is for the journalists on the panel in particular. So obviously there's a massive chilling effect in response to the Snowden revelations as we realize that we're under surveillance, particularly national security reporters. So my question is, do you feel that sources are drying up because of this and people won't come forward because they think that you're under surveillance? Or is it actually the opposite and people are inspired by Snowden and the encryption is enabling more sources?
It's hard to know who doesn't come to you. So there's sort of that problem up front. I do feel there's sort of you get it on both ends. I've had certain sources or even just contacts who I've had for a long time who consider Snowden to be the vilest of traitors and thinks what we did at the Guardian was completely unethical and terrible for the country. And some of them, even though some won't talk to me anymore, others, when they do talk to me, I hear it again. But I do think there have been there's an inspiring effect by Snowden that you will see ripple out. Maybe not immediately, although in at least one case we know of that's happened. I think it's going to come and it'll happen further. But Edward Snowdens of the world are 0.00000001. The next one of these that happens probably won't look like Snowden. This runs a spectrum, and what Snowden did was without any, even before you get to a value judgment about it, extremely exceptional, and we shouldn't think of going forward more people to. Even if they are inspired by him, to model themselves on him, probably.
I would say it's probably a double-edged sword. I mean, again, as Spencer says, it's hard to know who's not calling you. I mean, are there sources that seem like they will call back less frequently? Sure, some. And is that because they're concerned? It could be, but it also could be because they're busy. I mean, there are lots of reasons that people don't call you back. Maybe they don't like a story you wrote. I think it probably has sort of inspired maybe roughly as many as it's sort of chilled. In talking with some people, my sense is that some people feel that not like they want to be the next Snowden, but that maybe the fact that he raised concerns gives them a little bit more confidence that if they raise concerns, it will be, it will be treated a little bit more, not legitimately, but it'll be taken into consideration a little bit more. And I think that, it's had that kind of effect in terms of inspiration, so to speak.
John Napier tie is a good example of that.
I'm going to look at this side of the room. Okay, I don't see any questions here, so I apologize because I know you guys are. All right, there's a question over here. The green hat.
Green hair.
A green hair, sorry, bad eyesight. Green hair.
Hi, so my question relates to journalists, but also to attorneys. It's kind of surprising to hear such mixed feelings about whether to encrypt or not encrypt when dealing with really intentionally sensitive information. Just because it's so easy for someone to get a hold of something just off the shelf, like a keylogger or any number of things, and target one of your sources or you. I'm kind of surprised to hear that so few people are interested in sort of either encryption at rest with an encrypted laptop, or using something like Tails, or using PGP. I also see virtually everybody here has a MacBook, which is really interesting for a crowd that's so interested in different types of security.
Micah, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, my feeling is that people should be encrypting stuff all the time, even if it's not sensitive. but I also think that, like, you know, before the Snowden revelations, there was like we knew that there was some dragnet surveillance going on, but I think that you know, Snowden kind of proved that, like, our worst fears are real, and that, like, all of the paranoid cypherpunks were right, and that, you know, chances are, if you're sending email and you're not encrypting it, that it's ending up in, like, XKeyscore or some other government database. Whether or not it gets looked at some point is a different story. But I mean, I think that when you're dealing with secret information, like you know, attorney-client privilege information, that lawyers should encrypt these conversations just to, like, help enforce their privilege, because I mean, I don't think that their privilege is being respected in reality.
And do you want to say anything about the MacBook issue?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I'm a big fan of people using free software, like open source operating systems, and, you know, trying to like not be locked in by Apple and Microsoft giants. I do think that, like, I kind of doubt that just using a MacBook means that everything you do is backdoored. But it definitely has. Yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah, down here.
Thanks. I'm Courtney Radge from the Committee to Protect Journalists. I have two questions. First, I just want to thank several of you for supporting the Right to Report in the Digital Age petition. And if people haven't looked at that, it's aimed really at ending surveillance and harassment of journalists, because I think we have to talk about personal responsibility that journalists can take, but also we have to create legal frameworks that protect journalists. But there's been so much focus on, like, encryption and kind of these smaller techniques that we can do. But what happens as I haven't heard anything about, like, geolocation and how do you use social media in a way that also protects your sources and where you're going. And as we get into the Internet of Things and we think about, you know, all of our devices and our clothing and our appliances being connected to the internet, how do you encrypt your watch or your t-shirt or whatever? So how do we take this conversation, which, you know, I think is still relevant because most journalists aren't using encryption, but how do we take it to the next level, given that we're going to be there, you know, with our clothes and whatever before we're there with our practices?
That's a great question. Micah, Julie?
I mean, that is a really good question, and I think that like the basics that we should start with is protecting our conversations that we're having, and a much harder problem is protecting metadata. So it's like, you know, we all carry around cell phones, which means that we're all just, like, you know, we're just carrying around tracking devices, and if the FBI has our phone number, they know where we are, and that's not good, and it's really, really hard to design, like, a cell phone network that prevents this from being possible, and the cell phone carriers don't have any you know, incentive to do this. And so I think that that's, like, a really hard problem. It's a much easier problem to solve, like, making it so that all of your email on Gmail is encrypted by default. It's a much harder problem to make it so that Google doesn't know who you're emailing. And I think that the you know, the Internet of Things, where, like, all of our device or all of our clothing and everything else will start being connected to the internet, is just gonna, like, be creating way more data that will be getting sucked up. And I don't think that there are very good solutions to this stuff, but, you know, and I mean, I think that a big problem is that companies that make products like this generally don't have an incentive to, like, make things protect privacy as much as they can. Because it just doesn't matter. And it's more expensive, and you know, and sometimes it's slower. But, you know, if you're, like, clothes that are connected to the internet doing stuff all the time, you know, routed all of their internet traffic through Tor, then it will be much harder for, you know, what your clothes are doing to be tracked back to your physical location.
Yep, over here right there.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Maria McFarland with Human Rights Watch, and I supervise that report that came out this summer about the impact of surveillance on journalists and lawyers. So just a couple of points on the lawyers issue and a question. One, privilege doesn't really apply. Maybe it exists when it comes to actual court cases. Your communications aren't being submitted into the evidence, but what the NSA has said is that they have a minimization procedure that applies only to people who have been indicted and are facing criminal charges and their communications with their attorney. So there is a whole realm of other privileged communications that are swept up by the NSA and probably used for other law enforcement actions. We did talk to a lot of lawyers, and many criminal defense lawyers were very concerned. And I agree, though, that at the law firm level, they weren't expressing concern, at least. And I think that was partly because they were concerned about their clients losing faith in trust in their communications with their lawyers. So maybe that's something that needs to be worked on some more. But I'm concerned about the nonprofit world because NGOs aren't having these conversations. At least not in this way. And it's wonderful that you're having this awareness-raising event on journalism, but we need to broaden the discussion to include NGOs that are working with human rights defenders, with activists on the front lines of all sorts of things, groups that are working in this country even on sensitive issues. And I just wanted to throw out there, if anybody has ideas or thoughts about how one can broaden this discussion beyond journalism, that'd be very useful.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it's a great point. We've just now had, from all our news organizations, a tremendous amount of disclosure and reporting about how extensive our vulnerabilities are. And any way of moving that into non-traditional fields or fields that, to speak to Morgan's point, might have not thought that they were vulnerable before is great. I don't know if anyone watches the show American Gangster, but there are lessons we can all learn from drug dealers who recognize operational security is a necessity. Starting out, there was this one guy named Little Melvin who had, among two of his rules, all phones are tapped, all strangers are the police. This gets you to a level of paranoia that isn't really healthy really quickly, but nevertheless, if you start out with the perspective that you're being mindful of your vulnerabilities, you're more likely to do things to address them, and maybe that should be a rule for NGOs too.
Back there in the blue shirt.
Hi, Steve Winters, Washington-based researcher. I'd like to ask Spencer if he could, or maybe the others also, if he could comment on this question of gatekeepers that's discussed. In other words, the people who have, for example, the Snowden files, and then you had to pass them on the New York Times, and now there's some debate about whether you're still in control of what the New York Times can publish from the files, and that's an example of sort of a technical thing. But
it's great weather we're having.
But the more fundamental question is, if you go to people like John Young, the issue is there are a lot of intelligent people who have an interest in knowing some of the material in that file. Bruce Schneier has made this point. Is anybody, there's no attempt to get by the gatekeepers to get any feedback from the sort of educated, concerned people about what should or shouldn't be released from the files, where at the same time, if you hear from Barton Gelman and so forth and so on, say the Washington Post checks with the government before they publish anything from the files. So the gatekeepers do check with somebody, but it's not essentially from the concerned civil rights public. So could this whole issue of gatekeepers, who controls what, who decides what's released, could you comment on that?
Sure. Without getting into any of the specifics of these circumstances, I think it's important for us to take seriously the idea that there's a lot of stuff that may have been handed to our news organizations that people can legitimately think more of it ought to be public. And I like a lot of what Glenn has been saying. Like, first, this wasn't the deal that Snowden made, and I think that sort of is an absolute that has to be respected. We take commitments to agreements that we make to our sources really seriously, and if we didn't, we couldn't pop. So, but perhaps the next arrangement won't have that caveat with them, and we should think through what it really means to publish as much or as by some stretches little as we have. I don't know if I have a formula for you, but I can tell you I think the conversation is important. And, one of the good things about, working on these stories is, my God, you will hear from everyone from every conceivable position, all of whom are united from different perspectives into disagreeing vehemently with what you've done. And when you mess up, you will definitely hear about that. And I think, in the moment, that might not always be the greatest thing to want to hear, but it's a valuable thing to hear nevertheless. Yeah, I'm sorry if this sounds evasive, but I think you are making an important consideration that I can tell you internally, we do take seriously, and people talk about a lot, even if for reasons that might be frustrating from the outside, you don't really get a lot of transparency on. But we do take it seriously.
Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt from the New York Times. I just had a quick question. We already talked about how journalism has changed, like pre and post Snowden. I was wondering if some of you great journalists up there can just talk about techniques that you follow now, more specifically for this audience, or mistakes that you've made, and now you're like, yikes, so you keep those from being replicated. Thank you.
You could check ssd.eff.org for the Surveillance Self-Defense Guide, which has a massive amount of really good techniques to follow to use encryption. ssd.eff.org, Surveillance Self-Defense.
I think this was also mentioned earlier, but EFF also has a good guide to specific tools that I've relied on, and to some degree, a relief to know that some things that I use that are up there have been vetted and passed the EFF tests. I don't know if I want to talk about mistakes that I've made because of sources and methods issues, and also because of my general embarrassment level and self-ponage, but it's very good to be aware of those mistakes and learn from them, I guess.
Over here, Clyde? Yeah.
My question is about the reporters, the impact of the recent ODNI order about talks to journalists that have not been explicitly authorized. My take is that, from talking to people, is there's a lot of confusion about whether this just applies to ODNI staff, and also whether the legality of it can actually, if it's even legal when we're talking about officers who have since left the government, because then this is, what's the term?
Retroactive?
Yes, retroactive. Thank you.
Yes, Siobhan?
That was sort of a weird product of like this back and forth between the Senate and the DNI, and it certainly is very hard to interpret. I think that, at least based on my experience, I'm not sure that it has had like a huge practical impact. I mean, if you're talking with people who shouldn't be, who shouldn't be talking to you, I'm not sure that a new policy, coming down from DNI affects their thinking that much, one way or the other. And I think, people will seek out journalists for reasons of their own. And so I'm not. It may affect the way that press offices deal with things. I'm not sure that it necessarily would affect at a major level kind of the reporting process.
Okay, this is the last question, and this gentleman behind there who's had his hand up a lot. Well, there's.
Hi, so when you mentioned the SHIELD law earlier and, the lack of federal protection for that, for journalists that aren't affiliated with the Wall Street Journal, is there like a pronged test that you would like to see included in the legislation that would say, this is what a journalist is, or would it be, expert testimony at trial to establish journalism credentials, or, how would you like to see that law shaped?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there are a bunch of different tests. I think the one that is in some ways the most inclusive would be sort of an intent test. Did you have the intent of getting information at the time that you were reporting that you were planning on sharing with a larger pool of people as a journalist? I mean, that's essentially what it is. Or were you just happened to be at the bar and a guy came and you saw something and you really have never been a journalist before, where maybe you didn't have the intent then. And that, if you get to an intent test, it probably includes all the sort of existing journalists and those who are citizen journalists and who really are trying it. But it's a tricky issue, and there's been a lot of pushback on all different sides as to how you define a journalist, especially if you're privileging them in some way. That would be it. Okay, well, so that is it, and I want to thank everyone very much. I really appreciate questions, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you.